fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren and Mr. Ben. No, Mr.
Who? What?
Mr. Martino. I was going to call you Ben Martino, like your dad.
Yeah, that's my dad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is Ben in the room? No.
No.
Would you want your dad on the show?
No. Sure. He did radio for a while. Yeah.
Well,
He'd be fine. He'd be fine.
I don't know.
We'd have to bleep him a lot.
Probably more than a lot. Probably,
Yes.
Crazy. As crazy as Gwyneth Paltrow.
Yes.
Gwen. Hope she's listening. No, I'm not going to talk about her. I'm not going to. Not this time. I've had enough.
Yeah.
Her ozone.
You've had enough.
Machine is just the best. I love it.
You bought one?
I bought 3.
Oh.
I want one for the studio, one for my room, and then one for travel.
Oh, that's perfect.
Yeah. I want ozone going up my
Wazoo.
Wazoo ozone machine. And it makes me healthy. Makes me feel better. See, because I've been sick a lot. I keep getting all these colds and stuff. So I've gone to Gwen to help me.
It's an ozone deficiency.
Yeah. I'm just not getting enough ozone up my ass. Anyway. Now, speaking of ozone, not asses. No, we're going to go on to our writer here. We've got an author here, and seems like I want to put him in the horror category, suspense horror and that sort of category. So Mr. Ben Monroe, thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me. It's nice to meet you guys, and I'm gonna not even talk about my own ozone therapy. That's private. I don't discuss that with strangers.
Well, it's amazing. We actually had an author on a while ago too that was talking about. He's got a new book out too, and he wants to come back and talk about ozone therapy, and it can fix you from all sorts of things. So we'll make sure we let you know when he's on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Updated. Well, you seem like a really nice, mild-mannered guy. And you got the wife, the 2 kids, and all this stuff. But you write stories about really scary things. So how does that work?
Well, that's a good question. I've always liked monsters and scary stuff. Quite literally going back as long as I can remember. I've got copies of stories I wrote. Well, I didn't really write. I dictated them to, nursery school teachers about werewolves and slime monsters and whatever. And I remember as a kid loving, I had a copy of the Classics Illustrated version of the Odyssey, which I used to pore over, and I loved all the monsters in there, the Polyphemus and the Scylla and Charybdis and all the horrible witches and stuff. And I don't know, if people tell me that I come across as a perfectly normal person, in real life, and I can have, conversations with actual humans, and then I, sneak back to my lair and type out these stories of brain-sucking monsters and eyeball-eating rats and stuff, and it's just maybe that's just the way I deal with the world around me somehow. Who knows?
That's interesting, So what happened to you as a child?
Really nothing. I mean, I had a perfectly normal childhood. Okay. I take that back. I can't say perfectly normal. I grew up in Berkeley in the 70s and 80s, so it was normal to me, but no, I experienced no major traumas that I can remember. Who knows? I think monsters and scary books and scary movies are neat.
Well, so when you attack something like this, when you're going to create a book and you're sitting down, like your new book is called The Seething. So when you sit down to write that book, how do you go about it? Like, what's your process in this? Do you come up with the kind of the idea, the kind of the hook? Is that kind of what it is? And then maybe a setting and characters, or do you have characters and you think, well, now I want to do this to them? Like, where do you sit when you do this?
Yes. No, all of the above. No, it's an interesting question because I never really have one specific place where I start. When I started on the Seething, I was out taking a hike near a lake, a few miles away from my house, just getting some fresh air, as one does. And we'd been in a couple years of a drought here. I live in Northern California, in the Bay Area, East Bay.
Yeah.
And we'd been going through a couple years of drought, and this lake that I, hiked around fairly frequently. I'd been watching it over a couple years, and the water level just getting lower and lower and lower until I was out there one summer and I noticed that the little floats, where people would sit on the pier and fish off of, or, dock their boat or whatever as they're paddling around, the little floats were actually resting on the ground. The water was so low that they weren't on the water anymore. And something just struck me. I started thinking, if there's a monster in that lake, it's a lot closer to the surface now. It sure would be a lot easier for it to get people. And that idea stuck with me. And just that concept and the image of that lake getting lower and the monster doing monster stuff. And I just started thinking about it. And I wrote a little story, about 1,000 words, just about a guy out for a row on the lake one afternoon. And this monster stuff happens. He encounters the thing. And then I couldn't get the story out of my head, so it just kept going. I started adding more characters and expanding the setting, and it sort of took on a life of its own. There have been stories I've written. I wrote one just a few weeks ago, actually, where I came up with the last line of the story first. I'm like, I don't know how to get to that point, but that's a really cool idea. And so I started writing the story to find out how that experience was going to progress. How did everything somehow lead to that last line of that little short story I wrote? So in answer to your question, I really have no specific way to jump into a story. A visual might hit me, an idea for a character, or just a thought that I want to explore.
Right. And I imagine now you're going to that lake, and you're saying how it's getting really low. Now, you're probably doing that because that's where you dump most of the bodies, and you're worried about them coming up. Is that?
My lawyer told me not to answer that question.
It might incriminate you. Well, they have to have the body first, Well, that's interesting. So I don't know, do you like old horror ones, like the old Godzilla movies and things like that? Were you into all that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Growing up, that's really where I got my start. One of the first films I ever remember seeing was a revival screening of the original King Kong. And I just thought that was so neat, the Willis O'Brien special effects. And it was just so cool. I was like 5 years old. I'd never seen anything really on a big screen before. And, seeing King Kong, that was really cool. From there, we had the Creature Feature show up here in the Bay Area. Bob Wilkins showed all the old classics, the Universal monsters, and then weird stuff like, the Incredible Two-Headed Transplant and Robot Monster and things like that. And then, like I said, I was growing up in Berkeley in the 70s and 80s, and the video boom came along. And I was able to get my hands on, legions of stuff that I'd never seen before, as well as more modern films.
VHS.
VHS. Remember? So
yeah,
some of those of you listening who don't know VHS, you just Google it and they'll explain it to you. These are movies the way we watched them in the 70s and the 80s, and they came on a tape.
Dave still does.
Yes, I do. I have the VCR.
There you go. See, somebody has to. You're the one.
That's right.
You're the guy.
I'm the guy.
But yeah, no, I loved all those movies growing up, and of course, I was reading at the same time. I love film as well as fiction. Of course, here I am, writing novels and talking about movies all of a sudden. But yeah, at the same time, I was reading, getting into Lovecraft and Barker and King and Anne Rice and all that. It was a very horror focused I suppose.
But what do you think made those movies work? Like, those old King Kong, Godzilla, and all that, because they were corny as hell in a way, but yet they still worked. Why do you think that is? Because the effects are not. They were good for what they were at the time, right? I'm not saying anything disparaging. I'm just saying that.
Sure.
You kind of know, and you kind of know that it's a lot of kind of silliness going on here, right? But it still really worked. Why do you think that was?
I think in many ways, and okay, so I'm going to sidestep tangent here. In college, I actually was a film major. I took some creative writing courses as well, but film was really my focus back then. So if we're looking at, the RKO studios, RKO, Universal Pictures, all that stuff, we're talking what, 30s, early 40s maybe. Film had only been an art form for about 40, 50 years at that point. And so you've got these guys who are kind of this, again, King Kong, Frankenstein, whatever, they're almost the second generation of filmmakers. And they're super enthusiastic and they're trying stuff. Like, I have this crazy idea. What about, island and there's a giant gorilla there and he squishes people? Yeah, let's do that. These guys, they love movies. And you could really see that love of a new art form coming through with some of those early films.
Yeah, with you had mentioned horror writers of like the 1980s. I was wondering if you were you more inspired by the quiet horror or the splatterpunks of that time?
Oh gosh, the splatterpunk. I read a little bit of it. Yeah, Barker kind of noodles around with splatterpunk. Yeah. I don't really know if I'd call him specifically one of the splatterpunks. I know you had Skip and Spectre, those kind of guys.
Yes.
And I've read a lot of their stuff, and it's not really my go-to, if that makes sense.
Right.
I actually just read Skip and Spectre, Light at the End, their vampire story,
yes.
Which was a lot of fun.
It is,
but it's not the kind of thing I think I would ever find myself writing. I like, when I'm writing, I don't want to say it's better than splatterpunk, but I tend to feel more comfortable writing the quieter style, the more suspenseful style. And I got squishy parts in my book. There's definitely some parts in the Seething where, jaws are coming unhinged and joints are popping and flesh is being flayed. But that's not my go-to. I like to build up anticipation before the creepy thing really happens.
Right.
Well, it's interesting how you've turned into a writer. Did you know you were always going to be doing this? Is this something that you planned to be doing when you were young? Like, were you kind of that guy that was writing stories at, age 6 and then it just kept on going?
Maybe in some ways. I think I've always considered myself a storyteller. I played around with fiction as a kid. I played an awful lot of, role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons sort of stuff. And I was primarily the game master. If you're familiar with these terms, I was the one coming up with the ideas for the stories, presenting them to my friends, and then I was, like I said, writing fiction here and there. I wrote some stuff for classes and things. And then, when I went to college, I said I was a film major. I was getting into movies. And I focused on screenwriting and directing in college, and played around a little with that. And then, life intervened and I did other stuff. I found regular work, but always kind of kept wanting to come back to writing. And so I had the opportunity come up a couple of years ago to really start delving into fiction. And I jumped at it, and it seems to have gone pretty well since then. I really enjoyed it, if nothing else.
Well, what makes a good horror book for you? Like, how do you, what's your criteria? That's the best thing.
My criteria, my favorite kind of horror story, and more so in the novel size stories than a short story, because you can only go so far with a short story. And it's funny, maybe this is out of left field a little bit. I like stories with believable characters in fairly believable situations, and then things go off the rails. I often use my favorite example of that is Stephen King's Pet Sematary, where you've got a family that's just moved into a new town. The dad has an understandable job. He's a doctor, and the mom's doing mom stuff at the house, and things are progressing and just kind of strange, but in regular ways. And then these horrible things start to happen to the family. The ghosts show up and the zombies start wandering around and doing bad ghost and zombie stuff. And I love that. So for me, yeah, I love stories about regular people that I can kind of sympathize with when then stuff starts to happen. And layered onto that, I really enjoy slow burn kind of horror. I often call it what I call it, like the hot sauce or the chili pepper horror, where you eat something spicy and then that first bite is like, whoa, hey, that's intense. And the more you eat, or the more you read or the more you watch, it just keeps getting worse and worse and building and building and building until you just can't take it anymore.
Until you're on the toilet. just saying,
If you want to keep extending the analogy, sure.
Yeah, there you go. So you're really kind of, now a slow burn, then you're really focused on your characters, right? Your characters are very important in the story then.
Right.
Like you have to get into a lot. Yeah.
I think so. And again, that's a big difference between a novel and a short story. With a novel, you can take that time, I've learned. The Seething is my second novel, so I'm an expert now. But yeah, and I've written a bunch of short stories and I think, 30 over the last couple of years. And with a short story, you have an idea and you got to get to the point pretty quick because, you've only got a couple of thousand to, 4,000 or 5,000 words to get to your point. So you have to rush a little bit with those, which is fun. It's a different style of storytelling. I appreciate them both.
Do you think of yourself as a natural short story writer or more of a natural novel writer? Do you have a preference?
I really don't at this point. I've done a couple of novels. I'm working on a third, and I've done a bunch of short stories. And like I said just a moment ago, I really enjoy the process for either one. Short stories give you a chance to just get your idea out really fast. And with a novel, you can meander a little bit. You can play with it. You can really see where it goes a little bit deeper.
Yeah, but there's a way of doing it. Like when you've got a short story, right, or it's something fairly small as compared to a novel, you've got to use your words wisely or something, because in a way, I've got to be able to read that. And within a really quick time, I've got to understand that character or characters that are involved in the story, especially with horror. I got to know why and all the details you got to be very particular with your sentences and how you structure what information you give.
Yes, exactly. Well, like I said, with a novel, you can meander. With a short story, you really got to, okay, here's my situation. Here's my characters. Here's where things are going. Here's the resolution. You really got to get as much information in that small space as you can.
But that's got to. What's the trick? I got to write this down. I got to figure out how to do this because I want to make some money here. So what's the trick? Like, how do you have to play with words a lot, or did it just come natural for you?
I guess in the end, it comes fairly naturally to me. And I think maybe if I was going to try to describe the process a little better, I feel like a short story, and maybe this isn't helpful at all, it's like watching an episode of something like, The Twilight Zone or Creepshow or Tales from the Dark Side or something. You've got an idea you wanted to say, hey, this is what I'm going to do. And, again, you set it up. It's like a joke. You set it up, there's the punchline. You just don't have the time to play, to really wander with it. You really just have to focus in on, this is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, it's an interesting process. It's totally different than what I am used to, but that's good. Because you're going to teach me how, and I'm going to make money.
Let's do it.
Rich and famous here. And
absolutely.
So underneath this, when you're writing a book like this, and with the Seething, is this purely entertainment? You just want people to be scared and freaked out and all that stuff, or do you have more? Is there more meat below that?
With the Seething, I think my primary goal for readers was to be entertained. To enjoy the story, to think about the characters, to maybe feel like the setting is real. For me, some of the stuff going on in the book is maybe metaphorical for things I was experiencing in my life. I know for a lot of it, honestly, I wrote most of the book during the COVID lockdowns, and just the idea of this family going on vacation. Wow, that sounds fun. Going out of my house, neat. Let's do that. So, and it's funny actually looking back at it. When I was thinking about recently, it's like how many scenes I have in this book are set with characters eating in restaurants, which was like a big, exciting thing, over the last couple of years, going outside and being around other people. That's pretty cool. So,
Yeah.
I don't know.
When I was young, they didn't have restaurants.
No, yeah. You have to go out and hunt your own brontosaur.
You just ate at home. You never went out to a restaurant. What's that? The drive-through? What? I find it interesting when you're putting something like this together, and in a horror story, how do you, let's say, write your characters? So you got teenage Kimmie Barnes, and how does this character become who they are and get developed, and how do you experience them? Like, what is your process in a character?
Well, I know, and everyone's different, of course. My process, I think I've used the phrase a lot recently that I write the story to find out what happens and to find out who these people are. When I'm writing, often a character just pops into the book and I start writing about them, and I'll just sort of imagine who that person is. I don't really do character backgrounds or biographies. I kind of feel like that's what the book is for. And so I'm learning about that character as I'm going. And a lot of times it means I have to go back and change stuff early on. But that's part of the fun for me, is to just have somebody show up in this story and no idea who this person's going to be. And suddenly they take on a life of their own. I learn about them almost like you would learn about someone from, meeting a new person. There's a character in the book, Officer Sean the Lashers. He's part of the local police department up there in Golden Oaks, California. And when I introduced her to the story, a fight had broken out in a parking lot early on in the thing. And she shows up to break it up. I'm like, okay, so Sean the Lasher shows up to break it up. That's great. She was not one of the characters I had originally thought about for the story. She showed up in that one scene. And I figured, oh, well, maybe they'll have to go back to the police station or see her wandering around town at some point, and we'll maybe see her again. And that'll be the end of it. So I gave her a name because I thought she might come back for one more scene. And I think I never actually went and did the math, but I think at least a quarter of the book now is told from her point of view. She was just so much fun to write, such an interesting character, that she kind of just took over and kept coming back.
When you talk about writing from her point of view, or any of your characters, when creating dialogue, can you hear your characters? Do you have an inner monologue? How does that work for you?
Yeah, I think so. When I'm writing for someone, each chapter in the book is basically told from a different character's perspective, or different point of view, right? And when I'm writing Kimmie, 14-year-old Kimmie Barnes, I'm kind of in her head, and I'm writing from the way I think that character would speak. And every character is the same way. When I was writing Lasher, I had a real sense of who she was when I was writing her chapters and her dialogue. And I don't know, I probably have some kind of internal monologue. I don't know if I can specifically hear them in my head. But I do seem to have a pretty good sense of who each character is as I'm writing. And each character definitely, has, in my opinion, a very different personality. So
you hear these characters and see them and all that stuff. Does this happen when you're driving too?
I do tend to, well, you joke, but when I'm out driving around or doing stuff, I definitely am thinking about the project I'm working on, whatever that happens to be. I read somewhere, it's something about like the synapses in your brain when you're experiencing different visual stimulus, right? Start firing in different ways. And so that's one of the things I've actually found is a great way to get unstuck or ruminate over a project if you're not sure where it's going, is to, go for a walk somewhere that you've never been before, or go, drive to work in a different way each morning, and just get different visual stimuli coming in. So that really has nothing to do with the question that you asked, but I always thought that was interesting. And that's
I agree totally. I think, well, it makes, the creative bug go, but I was just wondering if you're waking up at night and there's like muddy shoes by the bed and maybe a shovel with blood on it or something, and just, you never know.
No, that would really be weird.
Yeah. That's what, let's start talking about that, it's okay. So you don't get to choose. So these characters just come to you and you don't get to choose them. They just sort of happen. What if it's like some really atrocious character that you don't like?
That's definitely happened, actually. There's been a couple characters that show up in the Seething, and a couple that came in in my last book, In the Belly of the Beast. I did not like them, and they did sort of take on a villainous aspect, but even then I tried to make them feel like real people. There's a couple characters in the Seething I would absolutely not want to hang out with or have dinner with. They're not the villains of the book. They're just not great people. The villain of the book is, a slimy lake thing. And the characters I'm thinking of, the McEwen brothers, if you've read the book, if you read the book, or anybody listening reads the book, the McEwens are two characters that I really did not like. But I enjoyed writing them. I thought they were still interesting people to write about and get into their heads a little bit, even if I would not want to invite them over for dinner.
No, you wouldn't want to sleep with them.
Absolutely not.
Well, maybe. I don't know. Sometimes we sleep with people we don't like. But it's kind of interesting that you say that. I mean, because I wonder how much of real life gets into your books, as in like real people. Like they always say that an author is, and part of you is in every single one of these characters, some of you, there's, and that sometimes you write a character that's a lot like you, or is almost you in a way. And so and on the same token, are you putting in people that you think are awful that or people you don't like, or people in the world that are someone you might not? Do you sort of put those in the book as well? Do you use real life characters to kind of influence you?
I don't think I have. In fact, I'm thinking about some characters I've written about. I've never done the thing of I hate a person, and so I put him in my story and kill him. Who cares? Who cares? Move on.
Well, you can make him suffer.
Find some better way to spend your energy. But I'm sure that there are characters in all my stories who are, inspired by aspects of people I've met throughout my life, just as, the settings of my story, even though, the setting of the book, The Seething, Golden Oaks, California, on the shores of Oro Lake up there in the Sierra Nevadas, is a complete fabrication. It doesn't exist. Never been there. You can't go there. Even the highway exits, I described very well in the book, I think, how to get there with street signs and highway signs and everything. And all of it's completely made up. But it's definitely based on, inspired by elements of places I've visited. The towns of Lockford and Jackson, California, definitely appear in shadowy form in the town of Golden Oaks. And I think the characters are very much the same way, even if they're not specifically inspired by a person I've met. There's elements of somebody's personality here, somebody's physical characteristics there. It's all, I guess, part of the writer's brain. You absorb things and it all comes bubbling out somewhere else.
Well, you said some of your characters just show up for you. Have any of them ever surprised you? Have they kind of taken over the plot and moved it kind of into a direction that you didn't want to go into?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned Shauna Lasher earlier, the police officer who was not meant to be there for more than a couple of scenes and was there for, a huge chunk of the book. And I really hadn't meant the book to have so many, investigative mystery elements in the thing. But when she showed up, all of a sudden it's like, wow, now we have this police officer who's investigating what's going on in town. I had meant it to be more of a, Friday the 13th kind of people staying on the lake getting murdered over a few days, and all of a sudden, well, now there's this whole other element. So I had to go do research and like find out like, the name and stuff, all those little funny details that get blended in. Stuff like that. There's always somebody who's going to show up and take things in a different direction. And for me, I mentioned earlier, I write these things to find out what happens. And that's part of the fun. I don't outline my stories at all. I go in with an idea. I jump in head first and see where it goes. And for me, really the fun in writing is following those threads and just seeing what happens next. I used to try outlining stories and novels and things, and not a single one of those that I ever did an outline for did I ever go back and complete. And I realized at a certain point, I think when I was writing my first novel, the reason for that was because once I'd finished the outline, I feel like, well, now I've told this story. I don't care anymore. I don't want to have to now tell it again, but make it even longer. I want to move on to the next thing. So, writing for me is a process of discovery, I suppose.
So being said, and also the way you talked about not outlining and all that, how is your process? Can you just set the time aside? Can you just kind of go, well, I'm going to work on the book, 10 to 2, Monday to Friday, and sit down and then turn it on and write and do it? Or do you have to do you have to be in a mood, or does the setting have to be a certain way? How does this work?
So what I try to do, especially being, you mentioned earlier, I'm a father, I've got kids, I've got a wife, I've got, a whole life to deal with. and that's not always conducive to writing. But what I do is I look through my schedule, a few days ahead, and just try to find an hour or so every day or two. I don't write every day, who can. And I try to break out chunks of time. I've got an hour this evening, I've got an hour, Friday morning or something, and just sit down and do it. I don't really think that waiting until you're inspired is a great way to actually get any work done. I think setting aside time and saying, I'm going to work right now. Right now is writing time. I think it was Stephen Pressfield, in his book, The War of Art, calls that button chair time. He says, just sit down and do it. Stop screwing around. Stop waiting until you're inspired. Just sit down, start writing. Even if you delete part of what what you start with, just start typing away and see where it goes.
Yeah, but I've got to have my bath and have my martini and and do my nails, and I have to be in the right place. My mind isn't there if I'm not.
Well, and if that works for you, and that's something else I've thought a lot about. In fact, over the last couple of years,
about doing your nails, or
about doing my nails. Yeah, I'm thinking of getting a French manicure after we talk here. No, over the last couple of years, my kids are in high school, and I've gotten to know their English teachers and the people at their library, and I've gone to their school during November for National Novel Writing Month, and I've met with groups of kids at the library who are doing the National Novel Writing Month thing together, and talk to them. Just what are you guys working on? And we talk about the writing process, and one of the things I really kind of push for them was to tell them, like, whatever works for you, do it. Read all the writing books you want, read all the advice articles and everything that comes to mind, or that comes across your radar, but figure out what process works for you. And if you're the kind of writer that has to stare off into space for 2 hours and then you can burst out a flurry of 1,000 words in 15 minutes, great. If that works for you, do it. If you're the kind of person who says, I need to sit down for an hour and just start writing and see where it goes, do that. Everyone's got a different process. And I think that's part of the thing that every writer needs to figure out for themselves is, what is the process that works for you? Don't take everyone else's advice, even my advice. Figure out what works for you and do that.
Well, yeah. I wish my teachers would say that. Just daydream for a couple hours. Don't worry about it. Now, I see you've written a lot of books and stuff like that. Do you have a favorite or sort of one story here that you've written that sticks with you even now, like it right through time?
I'm looking at my shelf here of stories. I wrote one, I guess about a year or so ago. And it finally came out this last summer, which I love. It's called The Patchwork Man. And you can find it in Blood in the Soil, Terror on the Wind, which is a collection of horror westerns. That was put out by Bridges Gate Press last summer. And The Patchwork Man, again, it was another one of those things where my brain made a bunch of really weird connections. And I suddenly was thinking about at the end of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, when the monster is set adrift on an ice floe in the Bering Strait or whatever, and he floats away, and Dr. Frankenstein yells at him, and that's the last we see of the monster. And I started thinking, but based on the timing, the monster could totally have just walked down through Canada, right? Ended up in the middle of America in the early to middle 1800s, and you could have a Frankenstein Western. Wouldn't that be cool? and I wrote it. It's a pretty simple story, but it was fun to write that character. I've always loved the Frankenstein monster ever since I probably saw the Boris Karloff, James Whale Frankenstein when I was, I don't know, 7 or 8 years old or something. And just the idea of a Frankenstein cowboy was a lot of fun to write.
Well, yeah, and Frankenstein Cowboy's Bride.
Yeah.
Wait till you meet her. So when you're doing all these, I just thought, and you got a title, Attack of the 80s? Attack from the 80s? Yeah,
that's another short story collection, and I've got a story in there, The Devil in the Details, which is about a guy who runs across so they're all short stories set in the 80s. And mine was one of them, hence Attack from the 80s. And I was riffing on the Satanic Panic, which was a big topic of conversation back then. And so I've got a guy who runs afoul of a cult of Satan worshipers living in the Hollywood Hills. And that was a lot of fun.
You have Geraldo Rivera in there.
Oh, yeah. It was really actually weird. I was thinking about the 80s, and so I put in characters that do weird stuff like smoke cigarettes and have pocket address books and stuff like that, because the 80s were like a whole different time back then.
I know it. I was young and wild, but things have changed. Someone's never read any of your books. Someone doesn't know who you are. What would you suggest they read to get the real feel for who you are?
That's a good question. I'd say let's go with The Seething. It's my newest piece. It just came out a week or so ago at this point, as when I'm talking to you. I really think it's probably the best thing I've written yet. It's my second novel. And I think I learned a lot during my first one and writing all those short stories. I definitely learned a lot writing The Seething, and I really had a good time writing it. So I'd say start with that. It's one big deep dive into how I write. And then, from there, I've got, if you look me up on Amazon or my website, you can find links to the books that have all my other short stories in them. There's a dozen or so books out right now. Each of which have one of my stories in them. So that might cost you a bit to find a lot of them, but start with The Seething. It's good.
Oh, but it's worth it. Come on. So old horror or new horror, which is the best?
Yes. You're going to get that answer from me a lot.
I have to say it. I mean, do you like what's going on with the horror community now?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff. As far as the community goes, there's some great people in it. I've met a lot of great horror fans and horror creators over the last couple of years. And like anything, there are some bad apples, and sure, of course. As far as the content, the art being made in horror right now, it's good and bad. There's a lot of great stuff coming out, and probably a lot that stinks. I can't keep up with all of it, but there's definitely some good stuff out there.
But do you like the way it's done now, more with effects and that than some of the older horrors, or where do you take on that? What do you do for when you're watching horrors? Do you kind of watch older ones?
Well, let me think here. If we're talking movies, I think I tend to, if I'm going back and watching things over and over again, I find myself tending to gravitate more to what, probably what I was comfortable with or what I grew up watching. And that could be anything from, old black and whites to 80s slashers to 80s, creature features. Oh gosh, I'm trying to think if I watched anything like that recently, but probably not. No, I watched some Friday the 13th movies a little while back, and they were, just as good as they've always been, which is, your mileage may vary. As far as the effects go, I mean, I think they've gotten a lot more polished lately, for better or worse. There's something fun about old practical effects, I think, especially, coming from my perspective as someone who studied film, and I was really into the idea of monster models and stuff as a kid and a teenager. And I like seeing the craftsmanship of, who knows, a monster that somebody had sculpted. You kind of know, okay, this is stop motion and how they did it, but it's still just the enthusiasm behind seeing what they created is a lot of fun. CGI, it's not quite the same, but I still know there was, people working on it, making that thing. And that's still kind of fun to see that there are still people out there pursuing some kind of creative art forms in the horror genre.
Well, do you think, when it comes to horror fiction, it had kind of its heyday in the 80s, and then by the mid-90s, there was kind of an implosion of the genre. Do you think there's a resurgence now with horror fiction that's going on?
I think there is, and I think there really is if you look past what they call the big five publishers. If you delve into what's going on in the indie press horror scene, and my book, The Seething, was published by a small press, Bridget's Gate, out of Kentucky. It's about as small as it gets, but they're putting out a lot of books, a lot of good books. You've got a lot of other little small presses who are trying stuff, publishing, I don't want to say necessarily experimental novels, but novels and short stories that the big five presses might not see as marketable, And that's sort of the same thing that we saw back in the 80s with the direct-to-video horror movies going on then. You would have films coming out from, oh gosh, I mean, like Full Moon Cinema. And I think even, New Line was
Charles
almost...
Band.
Yeah, Charles Band, exactly. And New Line was almost indie at that point. I guess they kind of were. They got pretty big over time, but you've had, funny little movies that would go direct to video that, that weird guy at the video store would have to say, oh, you got to check out, whatever, Screamers or, Critters or whatever. All those funny things that would never get mainstream theatrical releases. And so I think that we're sort of seeing that in horror fiction right now. These indie presses are putting out stuff that's really neat, really fun, and might not get mainstream attention. So God bless them.
So Mystery Science Theater 3000 or Svengoolie?
Creature features. We did get some Svengoolie up here. I think we actually had Son of Svengoolie. That was the Saturday afternoon show we had here on channel 2 or channel 44, I can't remember, in the Bay Area. Mystery Science Theater 3000 I watched a few times, but actually it annoyed me, mostly because it felt like what me and my friends used to all do when we just get together and watch crappy movies and make fun of them. But they were getting paid for it and I wasn't, and that made me mad. So
yeah, so he could do your own version now. We can see you coming up now.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, so Ben, are you big on social media, websites, Tinder, Grindr? Like, where do people find Ben Monroe? Like, where is it they go to find you?
The one-stop shopping is benmonroe.com. That's my website. As far as social media goes, I'm pretty much mostly active on Twitter. I've got a Facebook account, but I really mostly use that for friends, family, and colleagues. I don't post a lot of public stuff there, but you can find me on Twitter at _BenMonroe_. And you can find a link to that from my website, benmonroe.com, which is probably the fastest way to go.
Okay, well, of course, we'll have that up on our website, so people can find you with one click. It's all easy to do, and we really appreciate it. We'll have your new book up as well. The book is called The Seething, and our guest is the author, Ben Monroe. Thank you for being here.
Well, Alan, David, thanks for having me. It was really, really nice to meet you, and I really had a good time talking to you.
Thanks, Ben.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Yeah. Good night. This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.